All right, what's going on, everybody? So I recently got an email from someone who reads the newsletter. They sent me a recent article by Kriss. It's called "The Internet is Already Over," and they wanted my thoughts on it. So I was curious to read it. I figured I'd record a little video sharing my thoughts. So in the essay, he's basically very, very negative about the internet, as the title implies. He basically says that the internet is completely over and done. Like, nothing of interest will ever happen on the internet again. He makes, I think, some very good arguments, and definitely writes in a way that I think has the right tone. I think it's very evocative of indeed how bad it's become, and the stakes and the just awful, kind of inhuman, deadening effects and atmosphere of the internet right now as we know it. So I think in many ways he hits the nail on the head, and the first part of the argument I would say I strongly agree with. I do agree that the internet is in large part self-destructing, and it seems to be reaching a kind of fever pitch right now where it seems to be kind of rolling over into something else. It seems like the internet as we know it just can't really go on much longer for many different reasons, and he gets at many of them. So I like it and agree with that part of it, and I think we need more serious thought and reflection and expression of precisely how bad it's really become. So I applaud the piece in that regard. I guess where I part ways is on a few things. So I'll start by saying I've always thought Kriss is pretty cool. I didn't get to meet him in England. I think I wrote him, if I'm not mistaken. I believe I sent him an email, but we never connected in England. I know Nina knows him. I'm sure we have many other mutual friends, but I generally think he's cool. I like him for what it's worth. So my critiques are just, purely impersonal, but I definitely think the piece suffers from a kind of general pessimism that I don't think is warranted personally. Like I said, I haven't met him, but it's pretty clear reading him that he's pretty much a kind of good old-fashioned humanist Marxist is how I think of his perspective, at least as I know it, and at least as it comes through in this particular piece. He makes kind of grand sweeping inferences about society and the culture by references to capital with a capital C. This is a kind of genre that was basically invented by Marx and Engels. And it's just a generally kind of gloomy, pessimistic, what Nick Land would call a kind of transcendental miserablist perspective, where you kind of are reading, the Wall Street Journal every day, and every big report about what capital is doing is a kind of tea leaf that is, needs to be decoded into how it represents kind of the end times. This kind of weak messianism is what Walter Benjamin called it, and it carries over into a certain kind of lineage, especially British, I would say, kind of classic Marxist humanism, where, yeah, you just basically imagine that capital, you always want to imagine that capital has reached its limits. It's always reaching its final contradiction. But the problem is, they thought that 10 years ago, they thought that 50 years ago, they thought that 100 years ago, and so on. And so, Kriss seems to be kind of indulging in that particular genre or that particular mode. I don't think it really holds up very well. I don't think it's ever been right. That mode, it wasn't right then, and it's not right now. So having said that, I should say I often myself dabble with a kind of apocalyptic mode in certain ways. In certain ways, it does look like we might be approaching something like a kind of apocalyptic moment. I think of Rene Girard, for instance, whose late work, I took this very seriously. I'm sympathetic to that. So I'm not above a certain kind of messianic register or a kind of apocalyptic register. My critique is not of that in particular, but part of my critique would be of Sam's particularly Marxist, and if I do say so myself, I would say naive, with no disrespect to him, a naive Marxist perspective on, decoding the movements of capital. So for instance, he talks about SoftBank's Vision Fund. If you don't know SoftBank, they're basically one of the biggest VC funds in the world. And they recently reported losses. And Sam Kriss writes about this as evidence that, capital has reached its end when it comes to investing in technology companies. That this is evidence that, Silicon Valley is no longer feasible or something like this. He makes these kinds of grand generalizations, and I know he's not a scientist. He's a writer. He's trying to stimulate, evoke, and entertain and all of that. So I'm not being overly scrupulous or anything like that. I do think the general gist of a lot of what he's saying is very true and important and very worth reading, and I applaud it. But yeah, on many details like that, I don't buy it. I don't agree with those details. And basically the reason this matters is because I don't in any way think that networking through digital technology is over. That's just kind of absurd. And he does basically seem to think at the end, he does basically say that he thinks pretty much everything that matters now moving forward is increasingly going to be just like through IRL, interactions. And I think that that's pretty much false. I don't really see how that's conceivable. I agree that the internet as we know it is dead, but the internet is in its first inning. This is probably the best way that I could summarize my disagreement with his piece. The internet, in some sense, is over in the sense that its current phase is coming to an end. We're definitely at some kind of watershed there. I agree with that. But it's not the internet as such is completely over. The internet understood as like humans networking through digital technology and things like AI and machine learning and computing and kind of paid apps and the whole kind of economy or political economy of digital computers and digital networking. The internet as we currently think of it is over, I agree, but the larger world of human beings doing things with digital technology in networked and increasingly sophisticated ways, that's not over at all. That's absurd to think that that's over and everything is just going back to meat space. We are going to continue to invent and reinvent new forms of computing and new forms of networking. And obviously, I think, very, very obviously, history is on my side in this regard. Technology, as we know of all of human history, has never just come to an end. It is constantly reinventing itself. And so another thing we see is that technology never goes back into its bottle. It's not like something is invented and then somehow it's just like completely memory hold, at least not if it's been as impactful as computer networking has been as we know it. It morphs, it molds and goes in different directions, and it's forked and reinvented and reinvented again. So yeah, I don't think that everything is just going to go back to some kind of IRL networking, like meat space, communication is all that's going to be the only thing that matters. I don't think that that's plausible at all. But I do fully expect totally new ways of linking our computers together, totally new ways of doing computing, doing digital networking, and of computing in general. So yeah, frankly, I think that this is very optimistic. I think it's great that the internet is over. This could not be more exciting, right? To me, this fills me with joy and excitement and possibility to be at the end of one inning. Josh Rosenthal talks about this. I think, in fact, I got that phrase from him. If you go back to listen to his episode on the Other Life podcast, Josh Rosenthal, the former academic historian turned kind of crypto investor and entrepreneur, he talks about this. He talks about how crypto is just in its first innings. Okay, it's like, sure, things are going to go up and down all the time, and you see the same thing with the early internet. But even the internet, even the digital revolution as we know it, is still in its first innings. So the idea of any kind of sweeping claim where you could imagine that somehow like all of the internet is over, or even all of crypto is over. Like you see this on Twitter, people today are saying that crypto is obviously just over. It's shown that it's fake. Like this is completely ridiculous and naive. It's still so early. And if you go back to like the early Renaissance, for instance, or the early Reformation, it's like Leonardo da Vinci didn't realize he was in something that would later be called the Renaissance. Martin Luther didn't know that he was at the beginning of something that would later be called the Reformation. Significant technological and cultural changes take a long time to play out. So the digital revolution, I think, is one. It's like, in the scheme of human history, it only happened like yesterday. We still have no idea what its implications are going to be. I would say the consumer internet, as we know it, what Sam Kriss is calling the internet, that is over. I agree, and Sam's piece is very important for that reason, but I would say that that's just the first inning of what the internet will really be in the long term. Like in 200 years, when people write about the digital revolution or the internet, they're not going to be talking about, Web 2.0 in the Western countries in, the years 2010 to 2020 or something like that. That's going to be one subsection in a much larger chapter, right? And so I agree with Sam that maybe that subsection is over. There is an important turning taking place, and it is important, and it's worth reflecting on, and it is significant. I think we are going through a significant watershed. But the idea of saying that all of digital networking or the internet altogether in the broadest sense is over, I think that's just obviously absurd. It's unduly pessimistic, and I think it really reflects more Sam's kind of temperament and ideological background than anything. And I'm not throwing shade on that at all. I quite like, in a way, the tradition that he represents. I think it's cool, and he represents it well. It's just, that's where I disagree. I'm much more optimistic, and I have a much more realistic model of how capital will always perpetually kind of reinvent itself. And right when you think it's found its final contradiction, it ends up not being the case, as Marx was, constantly disappointed in his own diagnoses. So there you go. That's my take. It's a good essay. I recommend it. I think it's samkriss.substack.com. You go check it out if you want to. Don't subscribe to my YouTube channel. Whatever you do not subscribe, okay? Please do not subscribe to the YouTube channel. Don't do it, all right? Don't do it. Everything I make is stupid.